There is a specific, suffocating agony when the man a woman bleeds for gives her crown to her own flesh and blood. Catherine thought her life ended the night her mate, the Alpha King, betrayed her. He didn't know she carried his heirs, and he certainly never expected the terrifying Lycan King to claim them as his own. The stone corridors of Highreach Castle were usually a place of comfort to Catherine, but tonight, the chill of the medieval autumn seemed to seep directly into her bones. A daughter of the House of Artois, Catherine had stood beside Alpha King Richard for 5 years, leading the largest werewolf kingdom in the Southern Territories. They were supposed to be the unbreakable alliance, a marriage forged by her father, Lord Henry of Artois, to unite their feuding packs. Instead, she was drowning in the silent, pitying stares of the royal court. It was the night of the Hunter's Moon Festival. The great hall below was alive with the roaring laughter of warriors, the clinking of iron goblets, and the frantic, rhythmic pounding of the ceremonial drums. Lord Harrington of the Eastern Marches was there, trading boasts with Duke Reginald, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Catherine should have been beside Richard, sitting on the carved oak throne, accepting the tithes of the lesser alphas. Instead, a wave of profound nausea and dizzying exhaustion had forced her to retire early to their private chambers. She pressed her hand to her stomach, a strange, fluttering warmth blooming beneath her palm. Her wolf, usually a quiet, composed presence in the back of her mind, was pacing restlessly. "Pup," the wolf whimpered, a sound so faint Catherine thought she had imagined it. She paused on the spiral staircase, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be? For 5 years, Richard's disappointment had been a physical weight on her shoulders. "An Alpha King without an heir is a king waiting to be slaughtered," he would tell her, his tone sharp, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once held. A tentative smile touched her lips. She had to tell him. Ignoring her fatigue, Catherine turned back toward the king's private solar, a secluded room where Richard often retreated with his generals to discuss border disputes. As she approached the heavy oak doors, however, the smile died on her face. Her enhanced senses picked up something deeply wrong. It wasn't the scent of maps, stale ale, or the musky smell of his generals. It was the cloying, unmistakable scent of crushed jasmine, her younger sister's signature scent. Beatrice had arrived at Highreach 3 moons ago, claiming the damp air of their homeland was worsening her cough. Catherine had welcomed her with open arms, giving her the finest chambers in the East Wing. Catherine pushed the heavy oak door open, the iron hinges groaning in protest. The scene before her etched itself into her memory with agonizing clarity, burning away every shred of innocence and loyalty she had left. Richard, her mate, the Alpha King to whom she had sworn her life, was tangled in the velvet drapes of the solar with Beatrice. His large hands, the same hands that had crowned Catherine Luna, were gripping her sister's waist. Beatrice was laughing a high, breathy sound of triumph as she ran her fingers through his dark hair. "Richard," Catherine breathed. The word barely left her lips, but in the silence of the room it fell like a warhammer. He froze, his head snapping toward her. For a fleeting second, Catherine looked for shame, for guilt, for the frantic apologies of a mate caught in a moment of weakness. But there was none. Richard slowly stepped back, adjusting his tunic, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. Beatrice didn't even have the decency to look frightened. She smoothed down her silken dress, a mocking smirk playing on her lips. "Catherine," she purred, her voice dripping with venom, "you should be resting. You've been looking so dreadfully pale lately." "Get out!" Catherine commanded, her voice trembling with the effort to hold back her wolf, who was thrashing against the confines of her mind, demanding blood. "She stays," Richard said. The absolute coldness in his voice felt like a physical blow. "This kingdom needs an heir, Catherine. 5 years, and your womb remains a barren wasteland," the pack whispers. "Lord Harrington questions my strength. Beatrice is fertile." Our seer, old Mother Agatha, confirmed it. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously calculated, that Catherine couldn't even weep. "She is my sister. You are my mate. I am a king first," Richard barked, his eyes flashing golden with his alpha aura, trying to force her into submission. But Catherine was born of Artois. She did not kneel. "I will not divorce you, Catherine. You will remain Luna in name to keep your father's troops at my borders. But Beatrice will bear my children. She will have my bed." Catherine looked at Beatrice, seeing the cruel ambition in her eyes. Her sister wanted everything that was hers, and Richard, blinded by his desperate need for legacy, was handing it to her on a silver platter. In that moment, the fluttering warmth in Catherine's stomach flared again. A new, distinct scent mingled with her own. The scent of rain, cedar, and Richard's earthiness. Two distinct heartbeats, faint but undeniable, echoed in her supernatural hearing. Twins. She was carrying his heirs. But looking at the man standing before her, a man willing to humiliate her, break their sacred bond, and elevate a traitorous snake to his bed, she knew the truth. If she told him, he would take her children. He would give them to Beatrice to raise as her own, and Catherine would be locked away in some high tower, a discarded vessel, kept alive only to appease her father's armies. Catherine met Richard's cold gaze, masking the terror and the fierce, motherly protectiveness that had just been born within her. "If you want her, you can have her," she said, her voice shockingly steady. "But I will not stay in this castle to be a spectator to your disgrace." She didn't wait for his response. Catherine turned and fled. She didn't pack trunks or summon her handmaidens. She took only her heavy winter riding cloak, a pouch of gold coins she kept hidden beneath the floorboards, and a silver dagger bearing the crest of her house. By the time the midnight bells tolled, signaling the height of the hunter's moon, she had slipped past the drunken guards at the northern gate. The autumn wind bit into her cheeks as she shifted into her wolf form, a sleek, silver-furred beast, and ran into the impenetrable darkness of the frostbite woods. She was no longer an Alpha's Luna. She was a mother, running for the lives of her unborn pups. The frostbite woods were not meant for wolves of the southern territories. They were a lawless, jagged expanse of ancient pines, deep ravines, and eternal winter. Catherine ran for 3 days and 3 nights, pushing her pregnant body far past its limits. The bond between Richard and her, once a bright golden thread in her soul, had turned black and necrotic, sending waves of agonizing pain through her chest as their physical distance increased. On the 4th day, the blizzard hit. She collapsed near the frozen banks of the Whispering River. Her paws were bloodied, leaving a crimson trail in the pristine white snow. Her breathing was ragged. She shifted back into her human form, wrapping her heavy cloak tightly around her shivering frame, curling around her stomach to protect the twin lives growing inside her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the wind, tears freezing on her lashes before they could fall. "I tried." Suddenly, the wind carried a sound that made her blood run colder than the ice beneath her. The deep, guttural baying of Richard's tracking hounds. He had sent hunters after her. He couldn't risk the political fallout of his Luna fleeing, or perhaps his ego simply couldn't handle being abandoned. 4 massive brutes, rogues hired as mercenaries by Richard's guard, emerged from the tree line. They were in their half-shifted forms, monstrous and cruel, wielding iron-tipped spears. "Well, well," sneered the leader, a scarred wolf with a missing eye. "The runaway queen. King Richard said to bring you back alive, but he didn't say you couldn't be a little broken." Catherine gripped her silver dagger, forcing herself to stand. Her legs shook, but she bared her teeth. If she was going to die here, she would take at least one of them with her. Before the leader could take another step, the earth itself seemed to tremble. The air pressure plummeted. A scent so overwhelming, so ancient and raw, flooded the clearing that it forced the mercenary wolves to their knees. It smelled of ozone, lightning, and deep, unyielding stone. From the shadows of the massive pines stepped a nightmare, a legend. The Lycan. Werewolves were men who could take the shape of a wolf. Lycans were monsters who walked as gods. He stood nearly 8 feet tall in his beast form, covered in thick, midnight black fur armor. His shoulders were broad enough to eclipse the moon, and his eyes burned with a terrifying, ethereal blue fire. The mercenaries whimpered. The leader tried to turn and run, but the Lycan moved with a speed that defied the laws of nature. In one fluid, brutal motion, he severed the leader's head from his shoulders with a swipe of his massive claws. The other 3 didn't even have time to scream before the Lycan tore through them, painting the snow red. Silence descended on the woods, broken only by the whistling wind. The Lycan turned slowly toward Catherine. She dropped her dagger, knowing it would be utterly useless against a creature from the old world. She stood tall, waiting for the end. Instead, the beast began to shrink. Bones cracked and realigned in a sickening, fascinating display of ancient magic. Before her, stood a man. He was toweringly tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in dark leather and steel. His hair was raven black, sweeping over harsh, aristocratic features. But it was his eyes that held her captive, the same piercing, stormy blue. This was King Alaric of the House of Wulfgar, the ruler of the northern steppes, the Lycan king, a myth used to frighten unruly werewolf pups into obedience. Alaric looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her shivering, exhausted form. His eyes paused on her stomach, and she saw a flicker of something unreadable cross his stoic face. His Lycan senses were unmatched. He knew instantly what she carried. "You are a long way from the warm hearths of the Red Earth Pack, little wolf." Alaric's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the hollow of her chest. "I have no pack," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. Alaric stepped closer, and she instinctively flinched. But he didn't strike her. He unfastened his massive, fur-lined cloak and draped it over her shoulders. The sheer heat radiating from it was heavenly. "Only a fool abandons a pregnant female to the winter," Alaric stated, his tone carrying a quiet, dangerous wrath. "And Richard has always been a fool. Come, my fortress Doncaster is not far. You will freeze out here, and I have no desire to dig a grave for a stubborn queen today." Too weak to argue, and realizing this fearsome monster was offering her salvation, Catherine allowed him to lift her into his arms. She passed out listening to the steady, thunderous rhythm of the Lycan king's heart. She awoke days later in a massive four-poster bed, surrounded by tapestries depicting ancient battles and crackling hearths that smelled of pine and roasted meats. Doncaster Castle was an architectural marvel carved directly into the side of a mountain, a fortress that had never been breached. Alaric proved to be nothing like the bloodthirsty savage the southern songs claimed. He was a ruthless ruler. Yes, Lord William of York, one of his bannermen, recounted how Alaric had once crushed a rebellion without lifting a single blade, merely by asserting his dominant aura. But to her he was fiercely protective. Over the next few months, as her belly swelled, Catherine became a permanent fixture in Doncaster. Alaric provided her with the finest healers, rich foods, and protection. They spent their evenings in his vast library, playing chess by the fire. She learned that he was the last of the pureblood Lycans, carrying the heavy burden of a dying race. "Why are you helping me, Alaric?" she asked him one night, moving her knight across the board. "I am the runaway mate of your greatest rival. Bringing me here is an act of war." Alaric moved his rook, trapping her king, before looking up, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because strength is not just in claws and fangs, Catherine. It is in endurance. You walked into the jaws of winter to protect your blood. That commands respect. Besides..." A rare, soft smile touched his lips. "Doncaster has been silent for too long. The sound of children will bring life back to these stone walls." He never pressured her. He never demanded anything in return. Unlike Richard, who viewed her as a vessel for his legacy, Alaric saw her. And slowly, the broken shards of her heart began to mend, knitting together into something stronger, forged in the northern ice. The twins were born during a fierce spring thunderstorm, their cries competing with the thunder echoing off Doncaster's walls, a boy and a girl. Catherine named them Arthur and Genevieve. From the moment they drew their first breaths, it was clear they were extraordinary. Though they possessed the golden eyes of the southern wolves, their vitality and strength were unmatched. And though they did not share his blood, King Alaric claimed them instantly. He stood by her bed, holding tiny Arthur in one massive, battle-scarred hand, looking at the infant with a reverence that brought tears to Catherine's eyes. For 3 years, they lived in peace. Alaric was a father to them in every way that mattered. He taught them to track in the snow, he carried them on his shoulders through the great halls, and his fearsome Lycan guards became their playmates. The bond between Alaric and Catherine deepened from mutual respect into a quiet, profound love. They hadn't taken the formal mating bite, but every lingering touch, every shared glance over the twins' heads, spoke of a devotion that made her past with Richard feel like a pale shadow. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles south, the kingdom of Ethelgard was rotting from the inside out. News from the south arrived via traders and spies. Richard's reign had become a disaster. Beatrice, for all her boasting and Mother Agatha's prophecies, was entirely barren. Years passed and she produced no heir. Without the political backing of Catherine's father's troops who had withdrawn their support when she mysteriously vanished, the Red Earth Pack's borders were constantly raided by rogues. Beatrice's true nature had quickly surfaced. She was vain, cruel, and obsessed with hoarding wealth while the pack starved. Lady Margaret of the Vale, a notorious gossip whose letters often found their way to the northern traders, wrote that Beatrice spent the kingdom's gold on imported silks, while the southern villages suffered through blights. The pack's morale was in ruins. Richard had grown paranoid, cruel, and desperately isolated. His obsession with finding Catherine had never waned, not out of love, but out of a bruised ego and a desperate need to reclaim his property to save face with his rebellious lords. It was a rogue spy named Thomas, caught trying to steal horses near the Whispering River, who finally brought Catherine's ghost back to haunt Richard. Thomas had seen her in the markets of Doncaster, holding the hands of two strong, golden-eyed toddlers. When the report reached Highreach Castle, the ensuing explosion of rage was legendary. Richard realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. She hadn't just been his Luna. She had been carrying the very legacy he had destroyed his kingdom to get. The heirs he so desperately needed were alive, healthy, and being raised by his most terrifying enemy. Blinded by desperation and a fragile masculine pride, Richard made a fatal miscalculation. He believed pack law, the ancient laws of the werewolf covens, would force the Lycans to return a mate and her offspring to their alpha. He didn't understand that Lycans bowed to no laws but their own. Richard rallied what was left of his fragmented army. He called in debts, hired mercenaries, and dragged a heavily armed host of 2,000 werewolves north, intent on marching to the gates of Doncaster to demand the return of his Luna and his children. The warning horns of Doncaster blew at dawn, a deep, mournful sound that rattled the teacups on Catherine's table. She rushed to the battlements, wrapping her thick fur cloak tightly around herself. Below, at the edge of the sprawling frozen plains, the banners of the Red Earth Pack snapped in the bitter wind. Richard stood at the vanguard, flanked by his generals. He looked older, haggard, his face lined with the stress of his failing kingdom. But his eyes, staring up at the impenetrable black stone of the fortress, burned with arrogant entitlement. Alaric stepped out onto the balcony beside her. He didn't wear armor, he wore a simple black tunic, his presence alone projecting a terrifying, suffocating dominance that made the air itself feel heavy. "He actually came," she whispered, pulling Arthur and Genevieve close to her legs. The children looked down at the army with curious, fearless eyes. "Desperation makes men foolish," Alaric rumbled, his hand resting reassuringly on the small of her back. A gesture of possession, of protection, of unwavering love. Down below, Richard urged his warhorse forward. He threw his voice using his alpha command, expecting her to cower. "Catherine!" Richard roared, his voice echoing off the icy mountainsides. "You have played your games. Pack law demands you return to your alpha. Bring me my heirs, and I will pardon your treason. The Lycan has no claim over what is rightfully mine." Catherine looked down at the man who had shattered her world for a lie, who had replaced her with the sister who hated her. She felt no fear. She felt nothing but cold, utter contempt. Before she could speak, Alaric leaned over the stone parapet. The Lycan king didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, laced with the ancient magic of his bloodline, projected across the battlefield like rolling thunder, forcing half of Richard's army to instinctively bare their necks in submission. "You stand on Lycan soil, Richard of the South." Alaric's voice was velvet and steel. "There is no Luna here for you to claim. There are no heirs of the Red Earth Pack. There is only my queen, and the children of House Wolfgar. And if you take one more step toward my gates, I will not just break your army. I will erase your name from history." The Alpha King had returned to claim what he threw away, but he was about to learn that the Lycan King never returns what he has sworn to protect. The true war for the North was about to begin, and Catherine would gladly watch Richard burn. The silence that followed King Alaric's thunderous declaration was thick enough to choke on. Below the imposing, jagged black stone walls of Doncaster, Richard's army shifted in profound, undeniable unease. The southern wolves were accustomed to the warm, rolling hills and temperate forests of Ethelgard. The biting, relentless wind of the northern steppes was already gnawing through their fur cloaks and freezing their resolve. They had marched north, expecting to demand the return of a runaway Luna, anticipating a swift surrender from a myth they barely believed in. They had absolutely not expected to face a towering beast of legend fiercely defending his chosen mate and territory. Richard's face, visible even from the high balconies, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His pride, already fractured by years of crop failures, rogue raids, and Beatrice's humiliating barrenness, completely shattered in that singular moment. He drew his massive broadsword, the polished steel catching the weak, fractured winter sunlight, and pointed it violently at the high iron gates of Doncaster. "Treason!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain of his fading alpha aura. The magic that once commanded thousands now sounded desperate and hollow in the unforgiving northern air. "They harbor our stolen future. They mock our laws. For the glory of the South, tear these gates down." The siege of Doncaster had begun, a catastrophic military blunder that would later be recorded in the annals of the werewolf covens as the Winter of Fools. To understand the absolute massacre that unfolded, one must examine the staggering reality of the two opposing forces that met on the ice that day. Strategic metric. The Southern Army, Red Earth Pack. The Northern Defense, House Wolfgar. Commander, Alpha King Richard. Desperate, prideful. Lycan King Alaric. Calculated, defensive. Troop count, 2,000 standard werewolves and hired mercenaries. 300 pure-blood Lycans and 500 northern wolves. Morale, condition, fractured, starving, exhausted by the march. Unbreakable, rested, fiercely loyal to their king. Tactical advantage, superior numbers, traditional siege weaponry, impenetrable fortress, ancient magic, home terrain. Richard's forces charged forward with a collective battle cry. A sea of brown, gray, and russet wolves howled as they sprinted across the frozen, treacherous plains. But Doncaster was not just a castle built on a hill. It was a weapon carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. As the southern vanguard reached the first defensive trench, Alaric did not panic. He simply turned to his commander, Lord William of York, and gave a single, sharp nod. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and entirely devastating. Lycans did not fight like regular southern wolves. They did not rely on messy, uncoordinated pack skirmishes or numbers. When the heavy iron gates of Doncaster swung open, 300 pure-blood Lycans poured out in their beast forms. These were 8-foot-tall engines of destruction, heavily muscled and clad in custom-forged steel plating. They hit the southern vanguard like an unstoppable avalanche. The sheer kinetic force of the impact sent southern wolves flying through the freezing air. The horrifying sound of snapping bones, shattered shields, and panicked yelps echoed across the valley, drowning out the howling wind. Catherine watched the carnage from the safety of the high balcony, her hands resting protectively on the heads of little Arthur and Genevieve. She felt no pity for the men dying in the snow below. They had marched 1,000 miles to drag her children into a life of political misery and imprisonment. However, as her heightened senses scanned the chaos of the battlefield below, a sudden, incongruous scent caught in her nose, making the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't coming from the bloody plains. It was coming from inside the castle, wafting through the heavy wooden doors of the royal wing. Jasmine, the cloying, sickeningly sweet, and artificial scent of crushed jasmine, Beatrice. Realization struck Catherine with the force of a physical blow. The frontal assault was a suicide mission, a massive, bloody distraction. Richard, knowing full well he could never breach the walls of Doncaster by brute force alone, had smuggled someone inside through the ancient servant tunnels passageways that only someone born to southern nobility, intimately familiar with the old architectural blueprints of high castles, would know how to navigate. "Guards!" Catherine snapped, her voice ringing with absolute authority to the 2 towering Lycans stationed at her door. "Lock down this wing immediately. No one enters. No one leaves. Protect the children with your lives." She drew the silver dagger she had carried since the night she fled Highreach. She stepped out of the nursery, pulling the heavy oak door shut until it clicked securely, and walked into the dimly lit stone corridor. "You always were entirely too clever for your own good, Catherine," a harsh, raspy voice sneered from the shadows of the alcove. Beatrice stepped into the flickering orange torchlight. She looked absolutely horrific. The years of bitter, consuming jealousy, paired with the immense stress of maintaining a lie in a rapidly decaying kingdom, had hollowed out her once celebrated beauty. Her skin was sallow, her hair dull and unkempt. She wore a dark, heavy traveling cloak, and in her trembling hand she held a jagged, curved blade dripping with thick purple venom. It was a lethal concoction of wolfsbane, mixed with liquid silver, designed to permanently cripple a wolf's healing factor and ensure a slow, agonizing death. "You shouldn't have come here, Beatrice," Catherine said, her voice eerily calm and steady. 3 years ago she would have wept. She would have asked why. Today, fueled by the harsh strength of the North and the fierce, uncompromising love of a mother defending her cubs, she felt nothing but a cold, calculating rage. "I had to," Beatrice shrieked, her remaining composure shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You ruined everything. I was supposed to be the glorious queen. I took your crown. I took your mate. I took your bed. But the pack still whispers your wretched name. And now, you sit in a fortress hoarding the heirs that are rightfully mine to raise. They are my children. And you are a barren, treacherous snake who poisoned her own nest. You have nothing because you built your life on theft." Beatrice lunged at her with a feral, desperate scream, thrusting the poisoned blade directly toward Catherine's chest. But she was painfully slow and uncoordinated. She had spent the last 3 years lounging in imported silk gowns, gorging on rich foods, while Catherine had trained diligently with Lycan warlords in the snowy, unforgiving courtyards of Doncaster. Catherine easily sidestepped her sister's clumsy thrust, grabbed Beatrice's wrist with a vice-like grip, and twisted it sharply. The bones snapped with a sickeningly loud crack that echoed down the hall. Beatrice dropped the poisoned knife, screaming in sudden, piercing agony. Catherine didn't stop there. She swept her leg out, kicking the back of Beatrice's knees, forcing her down to the freezing cold stone floor. In one fluid motion, she pressed the razor-sharp edge of her silver dagger directly against her sister's throat. "Please," Beatrice whimpered, ugly tears streaking her ruined, desperate face. The arrogant bravado was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic terror of a cornered rat. "Catherine, please! I am your sister. A sister who covets her blood's downfall is no sister at all. She is a stranger wearing a familiar face, a thief in the guise of kin. The Book of the First Moon. You stopped being my sister the exact moment I smelled your jasmine in Richard's bed," Catherine whispered coldly, pressing the silver blade just firmly enough to draw a single bright bead of blood. She wanted to kill her. Her inner wolf thrashed and howled for it, demanding blood for the treason committed against them. But she was not a murderer. She was a queen, and queens dispense justice, not petty vengeance. "Guards!" Catherine called out. Heavy armored footsteps thundered down the hall within seconds. "Take this woman to the deepest, coldest dungeon. Bind her with silver chains. She will remain there until the battle outside is over, and then she will stand trial for the attempted assassination of the royal heirs." As the massive guards dragged, violently sobbing, thrashing Beatrice away by her arms, a sudden, deafening roar shook the very foundations of the castle, vibrating through the soles of Catherine's boots. She sheathed her dagger and rushed back to the nursery balcony. The chaotic battle on the plains had abruptly stopped. The clash of steel and the cries of the dying had ceased entirely, leaving a wide, terrifying circle of trampled, bloodied snow in the very center of the battlefield. The armies had pulled back, forming a ring around the two leaders. King Alaric and Alpha Richard stood in the center, directly facing each other. The final, inevitable confrontation had finally arrived. Richard was panting heavily, his armor dented, his face smeared with soot and blood. He had shifted into his wolf form, a massive, russet-colored beast, but next to Alaric, he looked like a mere pup. Alaric had not fully shifted. He remained in his human form, though his eyes burned with blinding blue fire, and his hands had extended into lethal, razor-sharp claws. "Submit, Richard." Alaric's voice boomed across the silent battlefield, devoid of exertion. "Your army is broken. Your siege is a failure. Surrender, and I will allow your men to march home and tend to their wounded." "I will never submit to a beast," Richard snarled, his voice distorted through his wolf snout. In a desperate, dishonorable move, Richard kicked up a cloud of snow and lunged, not with his fangs, but with a hidden weapon, a heavily silver-plated spear, tipped with concentrated wolfsbane. He drove it directly into Alaric's side. A collective gasp echoed from the battlements. Silver and wolfsbane were lethal to any southern wolf. Richard barked a laugh of triumph, thinking he had felled the immortal Lycan king. But Richard's ignorance was his ultimate undoing. Alaric was not a southern werewolf. He was a pure-blood Lycan, born of ancient magic and deep earth. Silver burned him, yes, but it did not kill him. Alaric looked down at the spear protruding from his side. A low, terrifying growl began in his chest, vibrating through the ground and shaking the snow from the trees. Slowly, agonizingly, Alaric gripped the shaft of the spear and ripped it out of his own flesh. The wound hissed, black blood spilling onto the snow, before it instantly began to knit itself back together, sealing completely within seconds. Richard backed away, his wolf eyes wide with absolute terror. "You have broken the laws of honorable combat," Alaric whispered, but the sound carried to every ear. "Now, you face the beast." In a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow, Alaric shifted. He didn't just become a wolf, he became the nightmare of the North. 8 feet of muscle, midnight fur, and merciless power. Before Richard could even turn to run, Alaric was upon him. The fight was over in less than a minute. Alaric dismantled the Alpha King with brutal, calculated efficiency. He shattered Richard's front legs, crushed his ribs, and finally, pinned the russet wolf to the bloody snow by his throat. Alaric did not kill him. Death would have been a mercy. Instead, Alaric leaned down, his massive jaws inches from Richard's ear, and unleashed a roar of pure, dominant Lycan energy. It was a spiritual assault. They could all feel the shockwave. The roar was designed to shatter an Alpha's aura, permanently severing their connection to the pack magic that made them a leader. Richard shifted back into his human form, screaming in agony as his Alpha spark was extinguished forever. He was left a broken, sobbing mess on the ground, an ordinary, powerless wolf. Alaric turned his massive head toward the surviving Southern army. "Your king is broken," Alaric roared. "Your cause is false. Take this pathetic creature back to your rotting kingdom and never look to the north again." The Southern generals, disgusted by Richard's dishonorable tactics and horrified by his defeat, stepped forward. They did not attack. Instead, one by one, they dropped their weapons into the snow and bowed their heads, baring their necks in submission to the Lycan King. The war was over. The aftermath and the Treaty of Doncaster. The following weeks reshaped the political landscape of the werewolf territories forever. With Richard stripped of his power and Beatrice locked in the dungeons, the southern kingdom of Ethelgard was on the brink of collapse. Seeking stability, Lord Harrington and Duke Reginald begged Catherine to return as their queen to restore order. She refused. Her home was the north. However, to ensure peace for her children's future, Alaric and Catherine drafted the Treaty of Doncaster. The terms were uncompromising. The banishment of the usurpers. Richard was exiled to the desolate Deadlands, a powerless rogue forced to wander alone. Beatrice was stripped of her nobility and sentenced to life in the Iron Sisters Convent, a silent order of monks in the Far East. The reorganization of the South. Ethelgard was divided into 3 smaller, self-governing territories, overseen by a council of elders who reported directly to the Northern Crown. The line of succession. Arthur and Genevieve were legally recognized, not as Southern heirs, but as the royal prince and princess of House Wulfgar. On the night the treaty was signed, the Great Hall of Doncaster was filled with music, roaring fires, and the joyous laughter of her children. Catherine stood on the balcony overlooking the whispering river, the moonlight painting the snow in strokes of silver. She felt a heavy, warm cloak drape over her shoulders. Alaric wrapped his arms around her from behind, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "You look like a queen who has finally found her peace," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. "I am a queen who has finally found her home," she corrected, leaning back into his solid embrace. Alaric gently turned her around. There was no grand audience, no political maneuvering, no desperation for an heir. There was only the raw, undeniable pull of 2 souls that had weathered the darkest storms to find each other. "Catherine of Artois," Alaric whispered, his blue eyes intense and reverent. "I claim you. Not as a trophy, not as a political pawn, but as my equal, my mate, my Luna." He lowered his head, and his fangs gently pierced the juncture of her neck and shoulder, the mating mark. The pain was a fleeting pinch, instantly replaced by a rush of golden, intoxicating warmth that flooded her veins. The ancient bond snapped into place, linking their minds and souls in a brilliant, unbreakable tether. Catherine had lost a false kingdom in the south, only to gain an empire in the north. She was no longer the discarded Luna, weeping in the shadow of her sister's betrayal. She was the Lycan queen, mother of twins, and she would rule the Frostbite Woods until the end of her days. Do you think Catherine made the right choice in showing mercy to Beatrice and Richard, or should she have exacted ultimate revenge? Let us know your thoughts down below. If you loved this story of medieval betrayal, fierce Lycan romance, and the ultimate comeback, hit that like button, share this with a fellow romance lover, and subscribe for more epic werewolf tales. Your support helps bring these stories to life.